Good day, fish tankers. It's a rainy day in Stellenbosch, but luckily we've got a roof over our heads and we're nice and cozy, lots of things to be grateful for. When I visit fish stores, I often ask the owner or whoever's working there, what are the trends in fish keeping? And I get lots of answers like aquascaping and planted tanks. But recently, I think I was at Cabin Aquarium and Kirsty told me one of the trends are nano tanks. And nano tanks, of course, is what is sitting here to the left of me on the corner of my desk. It's basically just small tanks. I'm going to do a deep dive into nano tanks to just tell you what are the pros and cons of nano tanks. If that sounds interesting, stick around. Okay guys and girls, before we get into the pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of nano tanks, let's just try and define what exactly is a nano tank. Where does it begin and end? Now there's a lot of different opinion, but it seems a consensus is that anything from 20 gallons and less qualifies as a nano tank. Now a 20-gallon tank is typically your 2-foot extra high tank, and I would actually say that a 15 to 20-gallon tank, your standard 2-foot to your higher 2-foot, is actually no longer really a nano tank. It's just sort of an in-between size to my mind, but they do qualify as nano tanks, and then it goes all the way down. What is the minimum size? I would say if you're going to keep fish, if you're going to keep livestock that's more than just a few snails or maybe a tiny shrimp or two, I would try and not go below 5 gallons, which is 20 liters. Now in Germany, I think there's a law that you can't keep fish in anything smaller than 20 liters. I'm not sure of it. I heard it somewhere on one of the YouTube channels. If you know that for a fact, please let me know in the comment sections. But of course, in South Africa, the standard 5-gallon, you can get it in those white glass tanks, but usually it starts at about 3.5, almost 4-gallon tanks, which is 30 centimeters by 22 by 22. That's about 15 liters. I would say you could still keep a fish in that, but I would limit it to say a single pea puffer or perhaps a betta or a Siamese fighter. I would go for those with the longer fins because they don't really move very much, but I wouldn't do much more than that. So I like to keep fish in not less than 20 liters. And as you know, I've got 2 nano tanks. The one here on my left, which is a 1-foot 30 centimeter cube. It's about 7 gallons. And there's a betta in there, a plakat, and some cherry barbs, and a couple of Otto Sinclair's and a Nerite snail. And then I also got a bookcase tank. I call it a bookcase tank because it's on a bookcase. That's your standard 5-gallon size. It's 36 centimeters by 22 centimeters by 26 centimeters, I think. It holds 20 liters of water, and that's home to 4 little pea puffers. Now, that as far as nano tanks go, sizes and so forth, what are the advantages? Well, the obvious advantage is that it doesn't take up much space. So if you stay in a studio apartment where you can hardly swing a rat, then that is maybe an option for you, because it will fit in anywhere. It can fit on a sturdy bookcase, it can be on your desk at work, it can just be somewhere in a corner instead of that big lamp to just brighten up that corner. So much less space. And then the second advantage, the second pro, is it's less expensive. That is not to say that nano tanks can't get very expensive. There are a lot of plug-and-play solutions, and these plug-and-plays can get expensive, or maybe you have a tank with a low iron white glass, like the one nano tank I have with puffers in. Now those tanks are more expensive, but still, if you're going to compare apples and apples, even if you have an 80A aquarium, the small nano version is still a lot expensive, a lot less expensive than the big one. And smaller lights, smaller heaters, smaller filters tend to be a lot less expensive. Along with that, they are more energy efficient. Smaller lights, smaller pumps to run your filters, maybe just a small air pump, they use a lot less wattage, they consume a lot less electricity. I'm not 100% sure about the heaters because they're on an awful lot more. If you can work out the electricity consumption with that, let me know in the comment section. Then the other thing that is nice about nano tanks, the fourth thing is but they present a unique challenge. If you want to do a little bit of aquascaping, that's how I started with a 30 centimeter cube of mine, and you want a different sort of challenge. This is a challenge because you've got to find tiny pieces of hardscape, and you've got to use all sorts of innovative ways to give an illusion of more space than there actually is. And the fifth advantage, I would say, of nano tanks, the maintenance you might have to do a little bit more often, but it's much less time consuming. Doing a water change on the cube next to me or on the puffer tank, it's very quickly. It doesn't take long to get that water out of a tank and back in again. It's zip zap and it's gone. Now, what are the cons of nano tanks? I think the number one thing is you've got limited options. Now, there's a lot of, if you're on the top range of a nano tank, let's say the 2-foot tanks, the 15-gallon or a 20 high, you've got a lot more options already. But as you go down in size to 7 gallons and 5 gallons, in that sort of range, or even smaller, 3.5 gallons or something like that, if you have the absolute minimum limit, your options become very, very limited. But the good news is we have a lot more options than we used to have, because there's a lot of interesting nano fish on the market now, like Chili rasboras, Celestial Pearl Danios, Pygmy corridoras, things that we didn't have before, Scarlet Badders. So there's a lot more options than there used to be, but just know, certain fish you're not going to be able to keep in a nano tank, and that goes for certain plants as well. An Amazon sword plant, it grows big. It's not going to work in a nano setup unless maybe you're at the top end of a nano setup and it grows out of a tank, and you have some emerged growth as well. Then the second con of nano tanks, you've got a very small margin for error. So if you're going to drop half a can of food into a tank by accident, you don't want to do that at all, but you really, really don't want to do it with nano tanks. So very, very careful with your feeding, and you've got to keep a little bit of a hand on your water parameters, because it can go south very quickly if you have a small volume of water. And the other thing with nano tanks, be careful not to overcrowd them. Sometimes you can keep quite a bit more fish than you would normally think you can, but be careful with your stocking on nano tanks. And then the third con of nano tanks I experienced the other day here, when we have these rotational power cuts in South Africa, but then a substation blew and we were for more than 24 hours without any electricity. And your big tanks, your 75s, your 55s and bigger than that, they don't cool down very quickly. Even my 29 or 30 gallon tank took a long while for the temperatures to get to a point where I have to start worrying about it. But your nano tanks cool down quickly because it's such a small volume of water. So that's something that you have got to keep in mind. Luckily, there's still some warm water in the geyser, so I could mix up some warmer water with the cold water from the tap and put the water conditioner in and do a quick water change to get the temperature up again. And we survived this more than 24 hours without power by not having any fish deaths, luckily, but that is a disadvantage of nano tanks. So that's it from me, guys. If you like nano tanks, let me know in the comments below. Tell me what you have, or what do you have it stocked with, and what your setup is like. If you don't like nano tanks, then also tell me why. And if you like the content, please remember to give us a thumbs up. I would greatly appreciate that. And please consider subscribing. That will also help the channel a lot. I'm determined to make this channel a success. And until we see each other again, keep on taking good care of those domestic denizens of the deep.